Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Whether you're working on local adaptation projects, planning for climate risk, or simply looking for hope backed by science, you're in the right place. If you enjoy these conversations, be sure to follow the podcast and subscribe wherever you listen. Share with your friends and colleagues too, anyone interested in building a more resilient future. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Our transport networks form part of our critical national infrastructure. They connect people to jobs, education, healthcare, and to one another. And they allow our supply chains to function effectively, moving the goods we need so they're in the right place at the right time. But they're also increasingly exposed to the impacts of our changing climate, from extreme heat and flooding to landslides and storms and coastal erosion. The challenge facing transport operators is no longer whether climate change will affect their networks, but how they can adapt. In today's episode, I'm joined by two leading voices from the rail sector who are helping to shape that response. Paul McBurney from Translink and Lisa Constable from Network Rail. We'll explore the lessons being learned from recent weather events, what climate resilience means in practice for rail and transport, and how the organisations are adapting ageing infrastructure for an uncertain future. So if you're working in infrastructure or policy or emergency management, or simply interested in how we build a more resilient transport network, I think this will be a really fascinating conversation. So Paul, Lisa, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. And maybe you could start by introducing yourselves. Paul, we'll come to you first.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Hello, Lisa, also. So I'm a chartered civil engineer, previously worked with the Highways Authority in Northern Ireland after graduating from university in a design section in highway structures, civil engineering assets across the whole of the province. I joined the rail sector 7 years ago with Translink, and for those of you who don't know who Translink are, we're an integrated public bus and rail provider for Northern Ireland. I joined Translink as a professional head and asset owner, so essentially wearing two hats in the railway infrastructure division, responsible for bridges, sea defences, earthworks, drainage, retaining walls, tunnels, viaducts, etc. Wearing two hats in the day-to-day job, I'm responsible for safe management and maintenance of assets, and also for setting the policy and strategy to make sure that they're fit for purpose for tomorrow. Another key aspect of my role is that I have taken the lead on the development of the first climate change adaptation strategy for the business, predominantly focused on railway infrastructure. So hopefully today I can illustrate in fairly practical and simple terms, from the perspective of an asset owner predominantly, what some of the challenges have been around our early adaptation journey, and we are at the start of that journey at present. So I'm pleased to be invited to partake in the podcast today, Phil. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's great to have you. You and I have been talking about this podcast for about a year, so it's great to finally make it happen. And Lisa as well. Maybe you could introduce you and your background as well, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Nice to be with you both today. So my role is Head of Climate Resilience and Adaptation for Network Rail. So we own and operate the railway infrastructure across England, Scotland and Wales and Great Britain. I've been in this role for 10 years and I sit in a national function that provides overarching strategic guidance, the standards and control framework for managing risk and providing guidance and support to our regions and routes who are responsible for delivery of and operating the railway on the ground. So I think it's my overarching role is making sure that the railway keeps operating in the future as climate change makes operating in weather increasingly challenging. And just trying to build a resilient transport system.
Brilliant. Well, look, in the introductions you've both given there are a lot of things that we're going to unpick. You've both mentioned infrastructure, assets, keeping the railways running, managing risk. So, going to dive in. So as I said in the introduction, the rail network is increasingly becoming exposed to the impacts of climate change. So this is where I'd like to start today. So how is the weather and more broadly our climate and the changing climate affecting the rail network? What impacts have we seen over recent years? Lisa, I'll throw that over to you first.
At the moment, we've had a lot of heat waves, so we're definitely seeing impacts from heat, but pretty much any kind of weather that you can get in the UK impacts the railway in one way or another. And there's a wide range of impacts and interdependencies affecting the system. Hot weather can affect tracks and power lines. Heavy rain can overwhelm drainage systems. It can trigger flooding and landslides. Storms bring down trees and damage infrastructure, and coastal routes can be affected by coastal erosion and wave action, causing washouts. And we've seen some dramatic evidence of that in the past with parts of the network being washed into the sea. I think the key point is that climate change is increasing many of the risks that we already face. We're seeing hotter temperatures, more intense rainfall, rising sea levels, more extreme weather, and the railway was largely built for the climate of the past. So one of our biggest challenges is making sure that it remains safe and reliable for the climate of the future.
And Paul, from the Northern Ireland perspective, I seem to recall there was a storm a year, 18 months ago, which was they put a red warning attached to that. I'm sure that would have impacted the rail network in terms of keeping trains running and speed restrictions and damage and so on. Anything else you'd like to add from what Lisa's just described?
Well, really, all of the above, Phil, from what Lisa has said. It's a similar picture in Northern Ireland. Yes, the Storm Éowyn was particularly impactful on the province in January 2025, when gusts over 90 miles per hour, and as Lisa described, incredibly difficult in terms of a combination of that wind with high tides, impacts on coastal routes, the impact on some of the trees around the railway network. So yes, it was incredibly impactful on the railway. I suppose, as well as I was thinking about the impacts, one of the key things for me when we think about weather and climate change is to sort of separate those two things from an asset owner's perspective. So weather, what we experience today, as an asset owner, tend to think, look, weather is what we know is going to happen this week. Climate change is very much what we're planning for tomorrow. And obviously the weather today has been impacted by the changing climate as well. There's also a danger when we think about climate change as asset owners to think about a problem that is sometime in the future. So we prepare for risks around present day, but also 2050, 2080, looking to the future. But it's not. It's really about dealing with the weather today and making sure that we prepare for the changes to that weather that we're going to face in the future, which is climate change. It doesn't really, Phil, for me, create a series of new problems for asset owners. And by that I mean the asset owners have always managed the assets based around weather conditions, the condition of the assets, the capacity of the assets. We've been designing for the future for a considerable period of time now. Certainly since I've been a civil engineer, we've been designing for 120 years plus climate change impacts on bridges, for example. But I suppose one of the key things is that we are seeing more and more data now which shows the impact on the railway network. The railways are really rich. One of the key things that I learned, I suppose, from coming from the highways to the railway sector is how rich in data the railways actually are around safety, service performance, the impacts of weather, asset condition, all of that. So we've got the data to prove that there are changes happening on the railway. We've got the data to prove it's becoming more costly and more impactful. And that data has been tracked for considerable periods of time, largely down to how we manage data from a safety perspective in the railway. So there's a really positive opportunity for us to document and understand exactly the journey that we are on and the risks that we're liable to face going forward in the railway.
And we'll come on to funding, I'm sure, in this conversation. But a really great place to start, and those impacts. And I'm thinking here about the points that I mentioned in the introduction about how society relies on the rail network. So, yeah, we've had all those impacts from heat and flooding and landslides and coastal sea levels, coastal erosion as well. And actually the impact that then has on society to just keep functioning. And, you know, Paul, you mentioned the storm there from January 25. You know, I'm sure there would have been enormous impacts on society in terms of, you know, people being able to get to work and school and so on and so forth. I want to start to move this into resilience then. You know, now that we understand the challenges that you face in terms of weather and climate, obviously every episode of this podcast we talk about, you know, what is resilience in the discipline that we're talking about, or the sector that we're talking about. So, you know, what resilience do you need to factor in? Do you need to build in to those strategies and to those plans? And, you know, what does that resilience look like for users of the rail network? Again, Lisa, I'd like to come to you first on that one.
Sure, no worries. There's a range of different activities within the term resilience. So you're looking at your preparedness for an event when it's forecast to be on its way, how you respond to that event, how you recover from the impact, and then in the longer term, how you build resistance into the system so that you can reduce the likelihood of impacts occurring into the future. What my role is focusing on is how do we adapt the infrastructure system in order to build that resilience so that we aren't impacted by weather events to the same extent. However, it's not possible to adapt our way out of every type of event. There will always be a super extreme storm that causes some sort of impact. And we're already seeing how significant the impacts are just from a hot summer, causing problems on the trains. And we had flooding issues over the winter. I'm telling people within Network Rail, this is the new normal, get used to this, because it's going to be happening more often. So we can't forget about the way we've responded in the future. In terms of what resilience we need to build into the system, government has indicated that we should be setting objectives to be resilient to 2 degrees of global warming by 2050. To do that across our entire network is prohibitively expensive. And to meet the other objective that they have, which is to perform to the same level as we do today, so kind of keeping delays and cancellations by 2050 to around about the same level as they are today, is also a very tricky thing to do when there is limited funding to be managing an increasingly aging asset base. How do we identify where we should be building resilience into the system? And for me, I think the key thing is, well, what is expected? What level of resilience or service do we need to build into the network? Because we don't necessarily need to have the entire network fully resistant to any kind of climate impact by 2050. So we've developed an approach to categorizing the network according to its strategic priority. Is it an important commuter route or freight route? Does it connect communities? Does it connect important industries? And then allocating, does that part of the network need to resist all but the most extreme events and never close? Yeah. Or is it okay for it to be down for a day, a week, a month, a few months? And therefore we need to look at closing the line and rerouting and moving people in a different way. So the work that we're doing at the moment is trying to help us understand how we can, what are those long-term ambitions in relation to the level of resilience we want to build into the system? And then how do we use our business as usual renewal and maintenance activity and our targeted adaptation interventions to help us build that into the system?
Brilliant. And I'm really interested in this concept of, you know, what is expected, I think was the phrase you used, you know, expected by government, expected by Network Rail yourselves, expected by society, you know, and the standards that we set around that. Paul, I'd like to bring you in because you mentioned at the top that you've been developing the climate adaptation resilience strategy for Translink. So again, from the Northern Ireland perspective, you know, what does that look like in Northern Ireland? What resilience do you need to build in and factor into your planning?
Much similar, only a much smaller network, Phil. And as an integrated transport company, we have the ability to obviously have buses on standby, so we cover both bus and rail. And we've become particularly good, I have to say, at managing weather events and being resilient without actually thinking about resilience. So by that I mean, you know, we've got an awful lot of good tacit knowledge around the railway network from people who have had 20, 25-year careers in Translink, who understand where sections of the track come under pressure under certain weather conditions. All of that stuff has been captured in policy, and we've used that to become more resilient on a day-to-day and year-to-year basis. So with severe weather teams and extreme weather teams, cross collaboration prior to any weather events, making sure that we have a fairly accurate and ever improving picture of how rainfall, how extreme temperatures are likely to impact us based on advanced forecasting. So so we've become naturally more resilient. What resilience means in the future is, I mean, even thinking about the term resilience in itself, there's a bit of confusion always around what resilience means. Some people think that resilience automatically means that nothing closes, and Lisa has already covered some of that. And I do particularly like the network rail approach to resist rapid recovery, bounce back. Do you fix it on failure? Do you reroute or close? I do particularly like that thinking, because not everything can be fixed for every particular extreme scenario in the future. It's completely unfeasible to do that. So yeah, so I mean, in terms of route sections, we have six route sections, and we will be looking at those in a similar way to how Network Rail have looked at their network. Only the Network Rail network's obviously at a much greater capacity.
Paul, I wonder if you could just expand on the point you made earlier about data and the richness of data, but also the importance of data. Presumably, then, there has been a ranking exercise of the risk exposure across the network to different climate hazards. So is that information then being used to, a bit like Lisa was saying, to then prioritize and identify the vulnerabilities, but also then the response activities? Is that sort of same approach that you adopt in Translink?
Yes, very much so. The performance-related data. So obviously, for some of the data which the railways do hold, are predominantly around asset performance, safety, service performance, the closures, the availability of service, all of that. So it's really, I suppose, service and safety focus predominantly as the data that's held. We do have data which clearly shows us in recent times that weather impacts on our assets have either equaled or exceeded the impacts of what we've traditionally have called asset condition related issues on the network. So weather has become more and more of a challenge, and weather will continue to become more and more of a challenge going forward. So we do have the data, and we will present some of that in as evidence, I suppose, in the strategy to explain why it is important that we take action now, preparing for the future, looking at the risks of the future. Some of that, the trajectory of, you know, the impact of storm events becoming more and more impactful, the expectation of the public as well. Phil, just what you had mentioned a few minutes ago about the public expectation on service, and there was one particular line that I think David Porter on a previous podcast of yours used, but the infrastructure is a service.
Correct. Yeah, he did.
And that resonated with me fairly clearly that I do believe, the public don't look out the window and have concerns over the infrastructure that supports the railway. They just want to get from A to B, and they want to get there without disruption.
Yeah, and thanks for the plug for the previous episode as well. But you're right. He definitely did make that point. And whilst you were talking there, I was thinking about how assets operate within a system. Assets are not treated in isolation, but actually holistically, with surrounding and dependent systems themselves. So yeah, treating your network in that way is obviously much more important. So we've spoken about your approach to managing ever-increasing climate risks. Lisa, you referenced trying to do more with sort of less funding, as it were, and meeting those expectations of performing to the same level as we do today in the future, but doing that with limited funding, but in a way that allows the system to still function. So how do you fund it? I know you spoke about prioritization and understanding those most critical routes for commuters or for freight, and prioritizing investment there. But what are your sort of longer term funding programs looking like in terms of the network, and how do you fund it?
Well, we fund resilience in the same way that we fund other major railway priorities. So that's through our long-term business planning and investment processes. The key is understanding where climate risks are greatest and targeting investment where it will have the biggest benefit. So we are in the process of investment planning for our next funding period, which starts in 2029. Mm-hmm. This is actually going to be an integrated track and train business plan. So to date, we've been Network Rail, which is infrastructure, but as Great British Railways is coming in the next year or so, we will be bringing train operators into our plans as well.
Right.
And so what we're doing from a climate resilience perspective is taking our long-term adaptation pathways strategy development work, which is what is helping us identify where our priority routes are and what our key risks are along those different corridors, and identifying what work will be delivered through our business as usual asset renewals and where we need to be targeting specific intervention from an adaptation perspective. And we're actually just commissioning a piece of work right now to really help us quantify the expected kind of financial impact of climate change on railway metrics. So on, how much might it increase delays and cancellations and safety metrics and revenue metrics, etc., so that we can see with no action, what might this be costing us? And therefore, what is the consequence of not investing? We want to be spending this money now. If we don't spend this now, what is the consequence on our long-term targets, on the bow wave of future investment required if we just delay? You can't not fix some of these problems, but if you push them into the future, they make them bigger problems and more expensive. So we're trying to build the business case, trying to really demonstrate the value of investment now and the consequence of not investing now, to be able to put forward a plan to government which very clearly sets out what we would like to do, why we want to do it, and hopefully they will give us the money to do as much of it as possible.
Yeah, and Lisa, you've mentioned a phrase there, adaptation pathways, that we've discussed many times on previous episodes. It comes up a lot. Identifying the critical points at which adaptation is needed. It doesn't all need to be done today, so it's about identifying what needs to be invested and when. Paul, what do the adaptation pathways look like for Translink?
So the adaptation pathways for Translink at present, now we are still, we do expect to launch our full final version of the strategy in August. So I'm mindful
Ah,
of the fact
okay.
that the strategy has not been made public just yet.
Yeah, sure.
But broadly, the adaptation pathways are four various categories. One of those
Uh-huh.
is that we look to additional maintenance activities. So we look to uh, uh, further expand on some of the proactive sort of drainage management that we have undertaken. We look to target inspections around the understanding the risks of future. So by that I mean, as a previous bridge inspector, you don't just look at the present day condition of the bridge, and typically you don't do that anyway. But you also then look at some of the defects and you try to triage the potential for a washout, say for example, of a bridge where you've noticed some minor defects, and the urgency considered the potential for that bridge to be washed out or adversely impacted in the next event that
Mm,
you have not
mm,
seen. So it's not just assessing on present day condition, it's looking forward. Um, so that's additional maintenance. There is a pathway around bolstering the maintenance activities that we already undertake and thinking about future impacts when we produce maintenance action lists. The severe weather preparedness is the next sort of pathway for us. So looking at how we respond and recover,
mhm,
ring fencing some project funding, for example, emergency capital project delivery to allow us for full recovery. So, going back to your question to Lisa earlier on funding, one
mm,
of the key challenges in Northern Ireland is that we are currently funded slightly differently, in that we have our budgets are set annually by local government. Now, that does not give us the certainty that we need to get into a control period type of funding program. That is improving and hopefully will improve. I know there has been recent conversations around 3-year budgets being set, so that will allow us a degree of certainty around having a pot of money that allows us to respond. At
mm,
present, it's more every time there is an event, we have to try to obtain the funding to deal with that event for full recovery. So by full recovery, I mean if an earthwork fails, for example, that you have to obviously make it safe immediately, get trains running again.
yeah,
But, but there will be a speed restriction potentially in place for several months if the funding isn't available to do a full repair.
yeah.
So that's additional maintenance and severe weather preparedness. The other two are around condition-led capital works. So I think Lisa's already touched on that. That when we have programs of condition-led capital works currently, and making sure, I suppose, that we have factored in the potential for future climate change and the risks that we are identifying in the strategy, and integrate that into our current condition-led capital programs. The last one is purely resilience-led capital interventions themselves, and that would be around the capital investment in assets where condition is not necessarily the lead indicator for action. Could be raising sea defences, for example. It could be slope monitoring sensors installation, and having to carry out some further strengthening works because of some of the indications coming from those. It could be improving the capacity of drainage, not because of condition, but purely because of capacity issues for the future. So that's kind of the fourth strand or pathway, I suppose we would see from the strategy.
Brilliant, fantastic, yeah, yeah. Look, it's amazing how quickly time ticks on these episodes. We've covered a lot already. It's been a great conversation. I suppose I've got one final question, and it's something I've asked on previous episodes, really. But why? Why is it that climate resilience matters to the rail sector? We've touched on it as we've gone through, but I'm just interested if you could sort of both sum that up, really. Paul, I'll come to you, and then I'll give Lisa the final word on this. So, Paul, why does climate resilience matter to Translink?
I suppose for me, as an asset owner of the railway, the railway is perhaps the sector within transportation that is most dependent on the performance of the supporting infrastructure. There's a significant proportion of railway infrastructure which still exists and dates back to the Victorian era, so 160, 170 years ago. We assume that the maintenance, they've been well built. The engineers of the past in the Victorian era built things to last. but they haven't particularly been well maintained, nor do we understand fully what we need that 160, 170-year-old infrastructure to do going forward in the future. So there's always that risk of infrastructure that was built to last, but has now got to a point where it's being asked to do a lot more than it has ever been done, than has ever been required to do. Railway infrastructure is important because it does provide a service. Going back to my previous comment, it connects communities, supports economic growth, it enables access to healthcare, education, employment, and it also, a resilient railway provides an opportunity to meet government targets and or societal goals around a low carbon alternative method of transport, and encouraging members of the public to get out of their vehicles and get onto public transport. So a resilient and adequately adapted railway is critical to facilitate net zero and decarbonisation targets. It's an enabler, is how I see that as well.
Brilliant, brilliant, love that. Lisa, final word from you on this then. Why does climate resilience matter to Network Rail?
Paul pinched part of my answer. I think, the railway really is an indicator of how resilient society is. Whenever there's a storm, whenever there's a heat wave, the media crews come straight to the railway to see how it's operating. And the railway is all about keeping people and goods moving. And if we aren't able to keep people and goods moving, then that has an often implication on the whole of society in relation to jobs, education, healthcare, family, putting food on shelves in supermarkets. And I think that, we have a responsibility as custodians of the railway to find a way of keeping it going in a way that is appropriate to the way that we want to be living in the future. And so that is a low carbon, resilient future. And what we can do to be building that into the system now, spending today's money on building that future, I think is really important. Climate resilience isn't just about protecting infrastructure, it's about protecting the services and connections that society depends on every day.
Brilliant. And there's the soundbite right at the end there. Thank you. That's been a super discussion. Thank you. And, I think what stood out for me, as you've both just very eloquently described, is that, resilience in the transport and rail network, isn't just about service reliability or asset performance, but actually there are these interdependencies on finance and organizational governance and strategy and people at the heart of that, and resilience isn't simply a function of asset condition, but actually whole system capacities and those interdependencies. So I've really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you, Paul and Lisa, for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've reached the end of our time today. If you've enjoyed listening, please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for our next episode in a month's time. And if you'd like to support the show, consider sharing it with others or leaving us a short review wherever you're listening. It really helps more people to discover and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.
The railway was largely built for the climate of the past, so one of our biggest challenges is making sure that it remains safe and reliable for the climate of the future.